This nondescript down-at-heel facade, located on Borough High Street, directly to the south of London Bridge, was formerly part of the Crown, just one of the many public houses that thrived in the district of Southwark in the early part of the 20th century. In October 1902, the pub's then landlord, George Chapman, was arrested here for the murder by poisoning of his wife, Maud. When it transpired that two of his previous wives had also died, exhibiting the very same symptoms as those displayed by Maud, their bodies were exhumed, and justice finally caught up with George Chapman, who was proved to be a cold and calculating killer. The man who would become infamous under the name of George Chapman was in fact born Severin Klosowski in Poland on the 14th of December 1865. At the age of 15 he was apprenticed to a surgeon by the name of Rappaport, with whom he would remain for the next 5 years, during which time he demonstrated considerable medical aptitude, as a result of which he gained numerous certificates and accolades. From October 1st, 1885 to January 1st, 1886, he studied practical surgery at the hospital in the Prague district of Warsaw, after which he became a surgeon's assistant, which was technically known as a feldsher in Poland. Again, he performed his duties diligently, and his employer provided him with a testimonial stating that he had performed his surgical functions with a full knowledge of the subject and his conduct was good. It would appear that he also got married around this time. In December 1886, he applied to the Dean of the Medical Faculty of the Imperial University of Warsaw, requesting permission to undergo the examination for the purpose of receiving the degree of junior surgeon. The secretary responded that the faculty could not see any reason to oppose his receiving the degree. In February 1887, a receipt which was found amongst his possessions following his arrest in 1902 was issued to him, stating that Severin Klosowski has paid to the treasury of the Warsaw Society of Assistant Surgeons hospital fees 4 roubles per month, Warsaw, February 28th, 1887, paid up till March 3rd, 1887. Since this is the last documented record of him in Poland, we can assume that it was shortly after this that he abandoned his job, deserted his family, and set sail for England. It was never established exactly when he arrived in London, but the probability is that it was either late 1887 or early 1888. Like many immigrants at the time, he settled in the East End of London, and he began working as a jobbing hairdresser. At Chapman's trial in 1902, Wolfe Leveson, a commercial traveller in hairdressing materials, testified that he had first met Chapman in Whitechapel in 1888, when Chapman was working as an assistant at a barber's shop in the district. Leveson stated that at the time, Chapman was going under the name of Ludwig Zagowski. He couldn't speak English, so they conversed in Polish and Yiddish, and Klosowski told him that when he was at Warsaw he had been a feldsher, which, Leveson explained, is an assistant to a doctor, what would be called a practical nurse in England, someone who puts on bandages and that sort of thing when the doctor tells him. Leveson stated that he found Zagowski to be very clever in medicine by what he asked in questions. He also revealed that Klosowski had once asked him if he could get him a particular medicine, but Leveson had declined, observing, "I don't want to get 12 years for that." By 1889, Klosowski was running his own barber's shop at 126 Cable Street, St. George in the East. In that year, he married a Polish woman by the name of Lucy Baderski, and the couple had a son together. 1890 found him working as an assistant at a barber's shop in the cellar of the White Hart Pub at the junction of Whitechapel High Street and Gunthorpe Street, a hostelry that still stands, and where a board on the external wall remembers the tenure of its most notorious occupant. By the end of that year, he had become the proprietor of the business, and the family moved to nearby Greenfield Street to be close to his place of work. It was then that his past caught up with him when his Polish wife arrived in London. Hargrave L. Adam, in his book The Trial of George Chapman, described Klosowski's handling of the potentially embarrassing situation. The two women met at his house. Both claimed the distinction of being the real wife, and neither would give way to the other. For some time, the two women actually lived in the same building with this enterprising barber. The records do not concern themselves with the kind of life led by the man during the struggle between his devoted spouses, but probably it was not without considerable excitement. At length, one of the women went away, disappeared, leaving the other mistress of the situation. The one that remained was his latest wife, Lucy Baderski. On the 3rd of March, 1891, their son died of pneumonia, and the couple decided to start a new life, and around April of that year, they set sail for America, settling in Jersey City, where Klosowski went into business as a barber. Here, Lucy became pregnant again. The couple argued frequently, apparently on account of Klosowski's frequent womanizing. According to an article that appeared in the St. James's Gazette on the 23rd of March 1903, on one occasion when the couple quarrelled, he held her down on the bed and pressed his face against her mouth to keep her from screaming. At that moment, a customer entered the shop immediately in front of the room, and Klosowski got up to attend him. The woman chanced to see a handle protruding from underneath the pillow. She found to her horror that it was a sharp and formidable knife, which she promptly hid. Later, Klosowski deliberately told her that he meant to have cut her head off, and pointed to a place in the room where he meant to have buried her. She said, "But the neighbours would have asked where I had gone to." "Oh," retorted Klosowski calmly, "I should simply have told them that you had gone back to New York." Shortly after this traumatic incident, Lucy returned to England, where she lodged with her sister, and on the 15th of May, 1892, she gave birth to a daughter, who she named Cecilia. 2 weeks after the birth, Klosowski returned to London, and the couple were reconciled for a time. However, Klosowski had no intention of curbing his incessant womanizing, and by November that year, Lucy had ended their relationship. Klosowski moved to South Tottenham, where he became an assistant at Haddin's hairdresser shop at 5 West Green Road, and he lived on the premises. One day, a lady by the name of Annie Chapman visited the shop, and Klosowski asked her out. Shortly thereafter, he suggested that she should become his live-in housekeeper, and, agreeing to do so, she duly moved in with him. It wasn't long before they were passing as Mr. and Mrs. Klosowski. But then Klosowski brought his estranged wife, Lucy, home with him, and introduced her to Annie. The three lived together for some weeks, but Annie decided that the situation was far from satisfactory, and she moved out. Klosowski, however, acquired a lasting legacy from their relationship, for he appropriated her surname, and thereafter he went by the alias of George Chapman. He never used the name Severin Klosowski again. In early 1895, Annie Chapman visited him to tell him that she was pregnant with his child, and she sought assistance from him. True to form, George Chapman refused to offer any support. Later that year, Chapman moved district and became an assistant at William Wenzel's barber shop at 7 Church Lane, Leytonstone. Recalling his former employee in January 1903, Wenzel told a reporter that he had advertised for an assistant, and one of those presenting themselves for the job was a foreign-looking man who said that his name was George Chapman, and that he had had a shop of his own at Tottenham, but had had to put the shutters up. I told Chapman that he might come for a week's trial if he liked. He did, and proved so first-rate a workman that I took him into permanent employment at 30 shillings a week. He was a very handy man, once connecting a gas stove, building a sliding arrangement for a window, and doing very difficult repairs. One of Chapman's regular clients at the barber's shop was Mr. John Ward, who Chapman asked to let him a furnished room, which Mr. Ward agreed to do. Also lodging with the Wards was Mrs. Mary Isabella Spink, the estranged wife of Shadrach Spink, a railway porter at Leytonstone station. Mr. Spink had walked out on his wife on account of her heavy drinking, and had taken their son, also called Shadrach, with him. However, soon after his departure, Mary had given birth to another son, who was christened William. It wasn't long before Chapman and Mrs. Spink had become intimate, much to the disapproval of Mr. Ward, who was not in the least bit impressed when one day in October 1895 he found them kissing on the stairs. Mrs. Ward told her husband to have a word with Chapman about his behaviour, and Mr. Ward duly confronted their lodger, informing him that his wife did not approve of the carrying on between him and Mrs. Spink. Chapman's response was, "It's all right. We are going to get married on Sunday week." Early on the Sunday morning in question, Chapman and Mrs. Spink went out. When they returned, their lodger announced, "Mr. and Mrs. Ward, allow me to introduce you to my wife, Mrs. Chapman." He told them that they had been married somewhere in the city, at a Catholic place. Mrs. Ward was incredulous. "Where is the certificate?" she demanded. Claiming that he was in fact a Polish Jew, Chapman replied, "Oh, our laws are different to your laws." The whole thing was a sham. Firstly, it later transpired that Chapman was a Catholic, not a Polish Jew, as he had claimed to Mrs. Ward. Secondly, following his arrest in 1902, the police combed the official records, but could find no evidence of any marriage having taken place. Wherever the couple went that Sunday morning, it most certainly was not to a Catholic place to get married. Mary had been left the not insubstantial sum of £600 by her grandfather, the money being held in trust for her benefit. Soon after taking up with Chapman, the trustees advanced to £250, and in March 1896 the couple used this money to leave London, taking little William with them, and they headed to Hastings, a coastal town on the south coast of England, 76 miles from London. Here they took lodgings at number 10 Hill Street. Also residing in the house was Mrs. Annie Helsdown, who later testified that she had heard Mrs. Chapman cry out once or twice in the night, and on each occasion Mary had shown Annie marks on her throat the next morning. Chapman opened a barber's shop, which, since it was in a poor part of town, wasn't particularly successful. So he took over an established business in George Street in Old Hastings. The building still stands and is now Albion Books, in the window of which is a sign that poses the tantalizing question, "Did Jack the Ripper work here?" George and Mary ran the shop together. Mary would lather up the clients' faces, and on occasion she would even shave them as well. At first the new shop fared little better than their previous establishment. But then Chapman hit upon a novel idea. Mary could play the piano, so he hired one, installed it in the shop, and his wife, having lathered up the customers' faces, would then sit down and play the piano for their delectation. These musical shaves proved massively popular, and soon business was booming. The family were able to move to a smarter residence, taking rooms at 1 Coburg Place, just around the corner from their previous address in Hill Street. However, you can't help but feel sorry for the little boy William, who, according to later accounts, led a miserable existence, being forced on occasion to sleep in the shop, frequently in a foul cellar below the premises. But life for Mr. and Mrs. Chapman had improved enormously. Indeed, so successful were they that Chapman was able to purchase a small sailing and rowing boat, which he named the Mosquito. Although he often boasted to his customers of his intention to sail the vessel over to Boulogne, he never got further than short cruises up and down the coast of Hastings, albeit he was always appropriately dressed in nautical attire whenever he put out to sea. The fishermen of Hastings, however, considered him more of a menace than a mariner, and their lack of faith in his seafaring abilities was soon proven justified when he managed to capsize the boat, almost drowning himself, Mary, and William. Only a fortuitous intervention by local fishermen saved them. One of his customers at the barber's shop was the local chemist, Mr. William Henry Davidson, whose shop was located at 66 High Street. He and Chapman used to discuss medicine together at great length, and Chapman made several purchases from him. Then, on the 3rd of April, 1897, Chapman called at Davidson's premises and asked the chemist to supply him with 1 ounce of tartar emetic, a toxic poison which in small doses was used as a medicine, particularly in the treatment of alcoholism. Davidson complied with the request, but made sure that his customer signed for it in the poisons book as required by law. The register was duly signed by G. Chapman. A reason also had to be given for the purchase, and Chapman scrawled something that was difficult to read, but which looked like "take." Davidson provided the poison in white powder form, and he dispensed it in a wide-mouthed bottle, to which he affixed a small red label which read, "Poison, tartar emetic, dose 1/6 of a grain to a quarter, to be taken with caution." Unbeknownst to Davidson, he had supplied a dangerous criminal with the means by which he would claim the lives of 3 victims. It was around this time that Chapman's perpetually roving eye settled upon another woman, Alice Penfold, a domestic servant who he accosted one Sunday evening as she was out walking in the streets of Hastings. He told her that he was a single man and that he was the manager of a pianoforte shop. She met him several more times, and on one occasion he remarked that she looked ill. Alice replied that she had a cold, whereupon he informed her that he had worked in a hospital and said that he would prepare something to relieve her symptoms. He sent her some powders, which she destroyed without taking. Alice Penfold may well have had a very lucky escape. By this time, Chapman was considering a change of career, and when he next met Alice, he informed her that he intended to take the lease on a public house in St. Leonard's and asked her to visit it with him. The two duly went to a public house together, and then they returned to Hastings. She never saw him again, but a little while later she received a letter from him informing her that he was now the landlord of the Prince of Wales Tavern, St. Luke's, London, and he asked her to come and see him. She did not go, and she heard nothing more from him. In fact, the Chapmans had sold the barber's shop to a neighbour and had left Hastings to return to London, where in the autumn of 1887 George took the lease of the Prince of Wales Pub in Bartholomew Square, just off the City Road. A few months after their arrival, Mrs. Chapman, who, despite her heavy drinking, had always enjoyed robust health, was stricken with a mystery illness. She became very pale, her weight dropped dramatically, and she became gaunt. Soon she was confined to bed, suffering from severe attacks of vomiting and diarrhea, accompanied by excruciating abdominal pains. Chapman engaged the neighbour by the name of Mrs. Doubleday to sit with his wife at night. Mrs. Doubleday immediately informed Chapman that his wife required medical treatment, and on Mrs. Doubleday's suggestion, local medic Dr. Rogers was sent for. He could do little for the patient other than write a prescription, which Chapman then administered to his ailing wife. He would also come into the room at night and bring a glass of brandy with her medicine. On taking the brandy, she would vomit. Chapman explained his wife's illness to some of his customers by informing them that she was suffering from the effects of her heavy drinking. Just before Christmas 1897, her condition worsened. Several times Chapman came into the sick room and asked Mrs. Doubleday to wait outside. She heard his wife say to him, "Pray God, go away from me," but Mrs. Doubleday never thought to ask what she meant by that. Dr. Rogers, meanwhile, had sent an experienced nurse, Elizabeth Waymark, to attend Mary during the day, and on Christmas Day it became apparent to the nurse that her patient was dying. Mrs. Waymark later recalled her final hours. When I saw she was dying, I went down 2 or 3 times for Mr. Chapman. At first he did not come up, and when he did, she said to him, "Do kiss me." She put her arms out for him to bend over to kiss her, but he did not do so. The last time I sent for him, just before she died, he did not come up in time. I prepared the body for burial. It was a mere skeleton. Mrs. Doubleday was also present when Mary died, just before 6 o'clock on Christmas Day. She later recalled how, following his wife's death, Chapman had gone into the next room and cried. But then he went downstairs and opened the pub. Mrs. Doubleday was somewhat taken aback. "You are never going to open the house today?" she asked. "Yes, I am," was Chapman's succinct reply. Mrs. Doubleday also recalled that Mary's son, William, was in the next room when his mother died. Mary was buried in St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Cemetery in Leytonstone on the 30th of December. Her coffin bore the simple plate, "Mary Isabella Chapman, aged 41 years, died December the 25th, 1897. As for her son William, Chapman showed true callousness towards him, and he tried to get the boy admitted to Dr. Barnardo's Homes as an orphan. When this failed, he approached Ernest Sibley, the relieving officer for the parish of St. Luke's, to have William Spink, aged 10 years, admitted to the workhouse. Chapman stated that the boy's mother, whose name he gave as Isabella Spink, was dead, and he informed Sibley that her husband had deserted her. William was subsequently admitted to Shoreditch Workhouse. Chapman wasted little time grieving the death of his wife, and in March 1898 he advertised for a barmaid. He received many replies, but eventually settled on a young woman by the name of Elizabeth Taylor, who was known as Bessie Taylor. Bessie hailed from Cheshire and was the daughter of a farmer. In London, she had been in domestic service before becoming the manager of several catering establishments. On being offered a job by Chapman, she moved into the Prince of Wales, and it wasn't long before history was repeating itself. Bessie and Chapman were soon married, or at least they went through a bogus marriage ceremony. On the night of their wedding, they were back working behind the bar at the pub. After a short time, the Chapmans moved to Bishop Stortford in Hertfordshire, where they took over the Grapes pub at 2 South Street. Here, Bessie was visited by her friend Elizabeth Ann Painter, who later told how, just before Christmas 1898, Bessie developed lumps on her face from her gums and spent a week in the local hospital as a result. When she came out, Chapman, so Elizabeth later stated, was very cruel to her. "He carried on at her all the afternoon," Elizabeth recalled, "and in the evening he frightened her with a revolver because he said she had been telling the customers that she was going into the hospital." In 1899, the Chapmans moved back to London, where George took over the Monument pub located on Union Street in Southwark. Bessie was very popular with the customers and locals alike. They found her both genial and caring. At Christmas, she made little dainties, which she distributed amongst the poor of the district. She was also a keen cyclist, and once the pub was closed for the day, she was often seen riding her bicycle up and down Union Street. However, towards the end of 1900, her health began to deteriorate alarmingly. Her brother William visited her at the pub in December 1900, and was greatly alarmed by her appearance. "She appeared to be very ill and shrunken," he later recalled. "She had gone like a little old woman." Bessie told William that she had violent pains in her inside and that she had been very sick. Around this time, her friend Elizabeth Painter came to visit, and she too was struck by the change in Bessie. She was, Elizabeth later stated, fading very much. She complained of pains all over her, and her head was bad. She got very thin. She always felt sick, and it always came on after she had had anything to eat or drink. Chapman seemed to take a ghoulish delight in tormenting Miss Painter about her friend's health. "When I went into the bar," she would later recall, "I would ask him how Bessie was. 'Your friend is dead,' he would sometimes say, but when I went upstairs I would find her alive." Bessie engaged a nurse by the name of Martha Stevens to look after her, and she complained to Martha that her throat was burning. The patient had soon taken a turn for the worse, and she began suffering severe bouts of vomiting and diarrhoea. On Martha Stevens's suggestion, the local doctor, James Morris Stoker, was sent for. He was unable to diagnose what it was that was ailing Bessie. He did note, however, that she would improve slightly after he had treated her, but then the symptoms would return. Baffled by the mystery illness, Stoker sought the opinions of several other doctors. One doctor thought that Bessie might be suffering from a severe form of hysteria. Another thought that it might be cancer of the stomach or intestines. So Dr. Stoker sent a sample of her vomit to the Clinical Research Association, asking them to check it for any traces of cancer. There were none, and unfortunately for Bessie, since it was examined under a microscope, the presence of any poison was completely missed. Dr. Stoker continued to treat Bessie as best he could, and he was very much heartened when, in early February 1901, she improved sufficiently to be able to leave her sick bed and had even played the piano. "Capital," was the doctor's response. He told her that he would not call on her again unless he was sent for. He was in fact called back the next day, and he found that his patient had taken a turn for the worse. Elizabeth Painter visited again on the 14th of February. Chapman was downstairs in the bar. She asked him how Bessie was. "About the same," was his reply. So she was somewhat surprised when she went upstairs to find that Bessie had died the previous day. Dr. Stoker had signed her death certificate and had given the cause of death as intestinal obstruction, vomiting, and exhaustion. 2 days later, her body was taken to St. Pancras railway station, from where she was transported to Lymm in Cheshire. Here she was buried in the local churchyard of St. Mary's, the cost of her funeral being paid for by her brother William, as Chapman claimed he had no money. Her gravestone can still be seen in the churchyard. The inscription on it commemorates her parents, Thomas and Bessie Taylor, her sister, Mary Gertrude, and then Bessie, died February the 13th, 1901, aged 36 years. According to Hargrave L. Adam in the trial of George Chapman, the inscription originally read, "In loving memory of Bessie Chapman, wife of George Chapman, and the daughter of Thomas P. and Bessie Taylor, who died February 13, 1901, aged 36 years. Adam also mentioned that then follows this verse, which savours very strongly of Chapman and may have been his own composition. "Farewell, my friends, fond and dear, weep not for me one single tear, for all that was and could be done, you plainly see, my time was done." However, Thomas and Bessie did not long survive their daughter, Thomas dying on the 11th of June that year, and his wife Bessie on the 22nd of August. Following Chapman's arrest and execution, the inscription on the family gravestone was changed to remove any reference or connection to their daughter's murderous spouse. Once again, Chapman spent little time grieving. In August 1901, an 18-year-old girl by the name of Maud Marsh placed an advert in a South London newspaper seeking a position as a barmaid. Tragically for her, that advert was read by the landlord of the Monument Pub in Union Street, Southwark, and he invited her to come for an interview. She was offered the job on the spot, and Chapman asked her to move into the pub. However, Maud Marsh's mother insisted on going with her daughter to ensure that her new employer's intentions were above board. On arrival, Mrs. Marsh noticed a ring on Chapman's finger, and she asked him if he was married. He replied that he was a widower. She asked if anyone else lived on the premises, and he lied that a family lived on the upper floor. Mrs. Marsh was satisfied that all was well, and her daughter took the situation and went to live at the monument. Mrs. Marsh was somewhat perturbed when, shortly afterwards, she received word from her daughter that her new employer had given her a present of a gold watch and chain. And then she received a letter from Maud saying that Chapman had threatened to dismiss her if she did not let him have what he wanted. Mrs. Marsh wrote back urging her daughter to come home immediately. Maud replied that she had been very foolish to have sent the first letter, and she promised that she would visit her parents soon. Sure enough, she turned up on the following Sunday, and Chapman was with her. He declared that he wished to marry their daughter, and, bizarrely, he produced what he said was a will in which he bequeathed £400 to my wife. He asked Mr. Marsh and one of his sons to witness it. Of course, the whole thing was bogus. A few weeks later, Mr. Marsh visited his daughter at the monument, and Maud told him that her employer had been paying her attentions. He had, she said, proposed marriage to her several times. Mr. Marsh advised her to be careful and to not do anything in haste or in secret. Shortly afterwards, Mr. Marsh was taken into hospital, and Maud came to visit. He noticed a ring on her finger, and he asked her if she was married. Without hesitation, she replied that Chapman had married her in a Roman Catholic room in Bishopsgate Street. Mr. Marsh asked to see the marriage certificate, but his daughter replied that George was keeping it. The couple, it transpired, had announced to the pub's customers that they were going to get married, and had duly set off in a carriage. They had returned several hours later to be greeted with cheers and confetti by their delighted patrons. Just before Christmas 1901, with the lease on the monument about to expire, George and Maud moved to the Crown at 213 Borough High Street. However, before they left the monument, Chapman attempted to burn it down in order to claim on the insurance. When the fire brigade arrived, they managed to put the fire out, and it was then discovered that the till and all the valuables in the pub had been cleared out. Suspecting fraud, the insurance company had refused to pay out, although no further action appears to have been taken against Chapman. By March 1902, Mr. and Mrs. Chapman were settled into their new premises. The following month, Chapman appeared as the prosecutor in a case that was heard at Southwark Police Court, in which he claimed that a woman by the name of Matilda Gilmore had tried to swindle him out of £700. Interestingly, he told the court that he was an American who had been in England for 10 years. According to Chapman, Matilda had been a customer at the Crown for about 4 months. In March that year, she had asked him to lend her some money and had said that she would leave as security 2 certificates representing 1,500 shares in the Caledonian Gold Mining Company Limited. Chapman told the court that he had taken the money in banknotes and gold from a drawer upstairs and had then handed it over to Matilda. Obligingly, he even provided the court with the serial numbers of the notes that he had given to her. The magistrate expressed surprise that Chapman had that amount of money in a drawer and not in a bank, to which Chapman replied that he didn't trust banks and had not had a bank account since 1896. It transpired that the certificates had been stolen from a Liverpool widow by the name of Mrs. Gilmore, whose name Matilda had then assumed, her real name being Oxenford. She was in league with a traveller by the name of Alfred Clark, and it was he who had given her the share certificates. The case went to trial, and Oxenford and Clark duly appeared at the county sessions on Thursday the 19th of June 1902. It was deemed that Oxenford had been under Clark's influence, and she was therefore discharged. Clark, however, was found guilty, and he was sentenced to 3 years' penal servitude. With the court case behind him, Chapman now gave his full attention to the running of his pub. The coronation of the new king, Edward VII, and his wife, Alexandra, was scheduled to take place on the 26th of June, and the post-coronation procession was due to pass down Borough High Street. Since the Crown occupied a prime position on Borough High Street, Chapman placed an advert in the South London Press on the 21st of June, offering private rooms overlooking the route at moderate rates. Unfortunately, the king was taken suddenly ill a few days before, and the coronation was postponed. The Crown, however, was doing reasonably well, and the Chapmans engaged a new barmaid by the name of Florence Rayner. She had been at the Crown barely a fortnight when one day Chapman suddenly kissed her and asked her to be his sweetheart. She later recalled that she used to take her meals alone with him and that he was constantly kissing her. On one occasion he even asked her to go to America with him. "You have got your wife downstairs," was Florence's reply. "You don't want me?" Chapman's response was to snap his fingers and say, "If I gave her that, she would be no more Mrs. Chapman." He told Florence that he would send her to America first, and then he would sell the business and follow her there. Although Florence later admitted that she was not particularly offended by the attention her employer paid her, she drew the line when one afternoon he came upstairs to her bedroom and his intentions towards her were more than apparent. Florence decided enough was enough, and she left. It was around this time that Maud was stricken with a chillingly familiar, mysterious illness. She began suffering with vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pains, and general distress. In fact, so sick was she that in July she was admitted to nearby Guy's Hospital, where the doctors were baffled by her malady, which they diagnosed as being incipient cancer, internal rheumatism, peritonitis, or acute dyspepsia. However, since the patient improved greatly under their care, largely of course because she was out of the baleful reach of her husband, they soon declared that she had recovered sufficiently to be sent home. No sooner was she back at the Crown than her symptoms returned. Shortly after her discharge from the hospital, her sister Louisa Morris came to visit her. Testifying at the inquest into Maud's death, Louisa recalled that she had suspected that her sister's illness was connected with Chapman. She also stated that Maud had told her that Chapman had used medicines, including frozen crystals smelling of carbolic and other appliances, to procure abortion. She had advised her sister not to take the medicines. On one occasion, Louisa even observed to Chapman, "It seems very funny that the doctors cannot find out what she is suffering from." Chapman's chilling response had been to hold up his forefinger and thumb and say, "I could give her a bit like that, and 50 doctors could not find out." Louisa asked him what he meant by that, but Chapman simply walked away, saying as he did so, "Never mind." On Friday the 10th of October, Dr. Maurice Stoker was sent for. Despite the fact that he had treated the previous Mrs. Chapman for the exact same symptoms, Stoker appears not to have been in the least bit suspicious, and he prescribed medicines for the patient, none of which had any effect. At one stage he suggested to Maud that she should go to the hospital, but she had burst into tears and told him that she had already been in Guy's. The following day, Louisa Morris paid another visit and found Maud in bed in a very bad way. On the Sunday, Louisa prepared some bovril for her, and Maud drank it, taking a small piece of toast with it. Half an hour later, Chapman came into the room and gave her a glass of draught ginger beer from the bar. On drinking it, Maud was sick again. Throughout the weekend, Maud's condition would worsen and then improve. Louisa left the Crown on the afternoon of Monday the 13th of October, and she duly wrote to their mother, informing her of how ill Maud was. As a result, Mrs. Marsh went to the Crown on the 20th of October. A few days before Mrs. Marsh's visit, Chapman, on the instructions of Dr. Stoker, had enlisted an elderly nurse by the name of Jessie Toone, who was a customer at the Crown, to look after Maud. On Mrs. Marsh's arrival, she and Toone nursed the patient throughout the next few days, but her condition did not improve. Chapman was in constant attendance, taking her pulse and giving Maud glasses of brandy and iced water, which she simply brought back up again. Meanwhile, Maud's father Robert was becoming increasingly concerned that nothing Dr. Stoker was doing appeared to be having any effect on his daughter. So he went to see their own family GP, Dr. Grapple, and asked him to visit Maud at the Crown. At noon on Tuesday the 21st of October, Dr. Stoker arrived at the pub to examine the patient. A little while later, Dr. Grapple turned up. Chapman told Grapple that there was already a doctor in attendance, but Grapple insisted on seeing Mrs. Marsh, and she duly came downstairs. She led Grapple up to the sick room, and the two doctors examined Maud together. Grapple was of the opinion that she was suffering the effects of an irritant poison, possibly ptomaine, and he informed Mrs. Marsh of this. When the doctors had gone, Mrs. Marsh made what would prove to be a fatal error of judgment. She went to see Chapman, and she told him that Grapple thought that Maud had been poisoned. Feigning ignorance as to how it could have happened, Chapman, it appears, decided to increase the dosage. On his way home, Dr. Grapple formed the opinion that repeated doses of arsenic might be behind Maud's illness, and he resolved to communicate his suspicion to Dr. Stoker the next day. Asked later why he had not sent word immediately, he defended his decision by saying that bringing in a diagnosis of repeated doses of arsenic is tantamount to accusing someone of murder, and I had no proof whatsoever. That night Mrs. Marsh did not go to bed, but sat in an armchair next to her daughter's bed. Maud woke up at around 3 or 4 a.m. on the Wednesday morning and asked for a drink. Mrs. Marsh gave her a little brandy and soda, which was kept in a small bottle on the landing outside the room. Maud instantly brought it back up. An hour or so later, Mrs. Marsh took a sip of the brandy and was herself then stricken with severe diarrhoea and sickness, coupled with a dreadful pain in the lower part of her stomach. Jessie Toone arrived at the Crown just before 8 a.m. and was alarmed at the change in Maud's colour. Her arm, about halfway up, was port wine colour, she later recalled, and her face and round her mouth was black. Jessie tried to give Maud some brandy, but Maud pushed it away, crying, "No, no, no." Toone then told Mrs. Marsh that the brandy might be too strong for Maud, and she took a sip to test it. It burnt her throat, and she had to rush downstairs to wash her mouth out to take the horrible taste away. Maud was now ailing fast. A little after midday, Chapman came into the room, and Mrs. Marsh heard her daughter say to him, "I am going, George." "Where?" was his callous reply. "Goodbye, George," were the last words Maud Marsh uttered, and at midday she died. It was Wednesday the 22nd of October, 1902. Dr. Stoker arrived shortly afterwards. No doubt Chapman thought that it would be a mere formality for the doctor to issue a death certificate for Maud. However, Dr. Stoker, concerned by Dr. Grapple's diagnosis, told Chapman that he would like a post-mortem, as he could not account for the actual cause of Maud's death. "What use is it?" was Chapman's response. Stoker stated that since he may later be asked what had caused her death, he should like to ascertain what it had been. Chapman responded that she had died of exhaustion. "But what caused the exhaustion?" Stoker inquired. "Diarrhoea and vomiting," was Chapman's retort. Stoker advised Chapman that he would not issue a death certificate without a post-mortem or an inquest, and reluctantly Chapman agreed. The next day Maud's body was taken to the mortuary, and, assisted by several other doctors, Stoker carried out a post-mortem examination, which shed no light on the cause of death. Stoker then removed Maud's stomach and other organs, placed them in 2 sealed jars, and took them to the Clinical Research Association, based nearby at No. 1 Southwark Street, where he asked analyst Dr. Richard Bodmer to examine them. Bodmer's first examination revealed the presence of arsenic, and a second the presence of a substantial amount of the metallic compound antimony, which would have been more than sufficient to have killed Maud. Bodmer reported his findings to Dr. Stoker, and he at once notified the coroner and alerted the police. Realizing that the game was up, Chapman began making arrangements to flee, but greed intervened. Saturday the 25th of October was the day on which the delayed coronation procession of King Edward VII was due to take place, and Chapman found the anticipated takings at the bar of the Crown too much to pass up on. He therefore decided to delay his departure for a day or two. It was just before midnight on Friday the 24th of October that Dr. Stoker contacted officers at Borough Police Station to make known his suspicions about Chapman. Detective Sergeants Arthur Fowler Neal and Monaghan immediately made their way to Borough High Street. Recalling that night in his memoirs, 40 Years of Manhunting, published in 1933, the by then retired ex-superintendent Neal wrote that an upstairs window was lit, and from the street I could see Chapman's silhouette, unmistakably his, on the blind. He was moving about, apparently very busy. Leaving Monaghan to keep watch, Neal headed back to the station, where he sent word to his chief, Detective Inspector George Godley. Neal then returned to Borough High Street. Hidden in the shadows across the road, he later recollected, the course of action was discussed. It was still early in the morning. There is no doubt that Chapman was on the verge of flight, but the cupidity in his mean soul made him anxious to get that day's takings first. At noon on that Saturday, the King and Queen set out from Buckingham Palace to make their way through the streets of London, and the crowds began to assemble along Borough High Street to await their arrival there. Few people paid much attention to the two men who made their way through the milling throng and pushed open the door of the Crown. Detective Inspectors George Godley and William Brewster Kemp stepped inside the pub, where they found Chapman serving behind the bar. The two officers approached him. "Are you Mr. Chapman?" Godley asked. "Yes," came the reply. "I wish to speak to you quietly," Godley continued. The parlour was empty, so Chapman ushered the two men into there. "I am an inspector of police from this borough," Godley told him. "Maud Marsh, who has been living with you as your wife, has been poisoned by arsenic, and from the surrounding circumstances I shall take you to the police station while I make inquiries." Chapman kept his cool. "I know nothing about it," he told the inspector. "I do not know how she got the poison. She has been in Guy's hospital for the same sort of sickness." "Before we go to the police station," Godley continued, "I am going to examine the bedroom where she died." Chapman made no reply, but led the two officers upstairs, where he unlocked the second-floor back bedroom door. "I am going to take possession of all medicine bottles," Godley told him. Chapman stooped down, picked up 3 medicine bottles that were on the floor by the fireplace, and handed them to the inspector. Godley then noticed a safe in the room, and, turning to Chapman, informed him, "If you have any money in that safe, you had better count it." Chapman replied that the safe was broken, and, taking a set of keys from his pocket, he unlocked one of the small drawers in a chest of drawers and took out £260 and 10 shillings, which he handed to Godley. The 3 men went back out onto the landing. Godley locked the bedroom door, left Kemp on guard outside it, and took Chapman to the police station. Around 4 p.m, Godley returned to the Crown, went into the bedroom, and took possession of several more bottles and other articles, including some medical books and 3 powders. In a box room on the other side of the passage, he found several boxes containing various papers, some of them in Polish and Russian. One of them was a Polish birth certificate for a Severin Klosowski. There was also a certificate for this Severin Klosowski having attended primary school in Poland, and various certificates relating to his apprenticeships and medical training. In addition, Godley also found receipts for the funerals of Mrs. Spink and Bessie Taylor, under the small red label that the Hastings chemist William Henry Davidson had attached to the bottle of tartar emetic that he had sold to Chapman in April 1897. Returning to the station at 7 p.m, Godley told Chapman that he was still making enquiries, but that he suspected Chapman of having poisoned Maud Marsh. Chapman's reply was, "She did not die suddenly. If she had been poisoned, she would have done." Godley then left to see the various doctors who had performed the post-mortem, and at 10:30 that night he returned and told Chapman, "It is now my duty to charge you with the wilful murder of Maud Marsh by poisoning her with arsenic." "I am innocent," was Chapman's answer to the charge. "Can you let me have bail?" "No," was Godley's succinct reply. On Monday, the 27th of October, George Chapman appeared at Southwark Police Court, charged with feloniously killing and slaying Maud Marsh. This would be the first of 16 such appearances, and by the time of his last appearance, almost 4 months later, the case held the record for the largest number of appearances made by a prisoner at a police court before finally being committed for trial. Inspector Godley gave details of Chapman's arrest, and then told the court that he has had 3 deaths in 5 years, 2 Mrs. Chapmans and Marsh. He also stated that Dr. Stoker was now of the opinion that since the second Mrs. Chapman's symptoms were identical to those displayed by Maud Marsh, she too had probably been poisoned. Mr. Sidney, representing Chapman, applied for bail on the grounds that there was no real evidence against his client, who was a respectable licensee who had denied the charge from the outset. Inspector Godley objected to bail, telling the court that "there is nothing to stop this man from quitting the country. He came from America in 1893, and there is nothing whatsoever to keep him here. He has no bank account, but between £200 and £300 in notes and gold were found at his premises." Mr. Taylor, the magistrate, denied bail, whereupon Mr. Sidney pointed out that the police had no right to the money that had been found at the accused's premises. Godley replied that he had no objection to handing over any sum mentioned, but Mr. Taylor ruled that all the money was to be returned to Chapman for the purposes of his own defence. Chapman was then remanded in custody. That night, according to the Dundee Evening Post, business was booming at Chapman's Borough High Street hostelry. The sensational happenings at the Crown, the newspaper reported, have naturally attracted an unusually large number of customers. On Monday night, the house did a roaring trade with the curious and morbid-minded who flocked into the bars. In his absence, Chapman has engaged a barman to look after the house. The next day, Tuesday the 28th of October, the inquest into the death of Maud Marsh opened at the Colliers' Rents Meeting Hall in Southwark, with coroner Dr. F. J. Waldo presiding. The room was filled with the kind of people who usually assemble at inquests, the Dundee Evening Post sniffily told its readers in its next night's edition, and a considerable gathering outside attested to the interest felt in the case. The coroner told the court that, since the contents of the deceased's stomach and her internal organs were yet to be fully analysed, the only evidence he would have that day would be in regard to identifying the deceased, and Mr. Robert Marsh stepped forward and identified the dead woman as his daughter, who, he said, lived at the Crown and whose name, he believed, was Mrs. Chapman. The identification having been made, the coroner adjourned the inquest. Meanwhile, the police were continuing with their inquiries. One of the main tasks facing them was that of identifying exactly who their prisoner was. Although he insisted that his name was George Chapman and that he was an American, the evidence was pointing to him being Severin Klosowski, of Polish origin. There was also the problem that, just as Chapman's solicitor had pointed out at the police court, their case against him wasn't a particularly strong one. It was evident that Maud Marsh had been poisoned, but there was no real proof that the poison had been administered by Chapman. There was every possibility that he would be given bail, and if that happened, the police were well aware that he posed a significant flight risk. It was then that the case of Arthur Clark came to the police's rescue. When Chapman had brought his case against Clark and Matilda Oxenford, he had obligingly provided the court with the serial numbers of the banknotes that had supposedly been stolen from him. On checking the serial numbers of the notes found in the upstairs room of the Crown, the police found that they tallied exactly with those of the notes Chapman had claimed Clark and Oxenford had stolen from him. If nothing else, the police would now be able to at least hold Chapman on a charge of perjury. This, of course, also meant that Alfred Clark had been wrongly convicted of defrauding Chapman, and at the end of December that year he was given an absolute and unconditional discharge and was released from Portland Prison. In January 1903, the Home Office granted his solicitor, Mr. Barrett, permission to serve a writ on Chapman in Brixton Prison for malicious prosecution, false imprisonment, libel and slander. However, Clark's case ultimately came to nothing. Maud Marsh's funeral took place on Wednesday the 5th of November 1902. The whole cost of it was borne by Chapman. According to newspaper reports, not even the damp, grey, cheerless weather could prevent a large crowd assembling. As early as 9 o'clock, eager-faced women and children were trying to peer through the windows of the room where Maud Marsh's body was, and despite the drawn red blinds, some of the curious gained a view of the pall which covered the coffin. In and out among the crowd slipped a number of hawkers selling in memoriam cards bearing the words, "In affectionate memory of Maud Marsh, died October the 22nd, 1902, aged 20 years. Interred Croydon Cemetery, November the 5th, 1902. In the immediate neighbourhood, the blinds of the windows of many private and business houses were drawn down. Following the hearse were 2 empty mourning coaches for the purpose of picking up the relatives of the deceased at Croydon. When the cortege moved away, many persons stood bareheaded and a large number followed in its wake for some distance. In Croydon, large numbers of people lined the streets from the residence of the deceased's father in Longfellow Road to the cemetery, and the latter place was also crowded. The coffin was of polished oak with brass fittings. Upon it were several beautiful wreaths, including one from the accused man, Chapman, with the simple inscription, "From a devoted friend, G.C." Some unseemly scenes occurred in the cemetery, the crowds struggling to gain admission to the chapel and to approach the grave. The drenching rain had no effect in lessening the number of people, and after the service in the chapel, the police had to clear a way through the crowds to the grave. And so Maud Marsh was laid to rest. Throughout November and December, the coroner's inquest into her death and Chapman's police court appearances for having murdered her continued in unison. Dr. Thomas Stevenson, one of the official analysts of the Home Office, had been asked to examine the contents of the deceased's stomach and other organs, and he testified at both the inquest and the police court that in his opinion the cause of Maud Marsh's death had been antimonial poisoning. She had, he continued, within a few hours of her death, drunk a large quantity of antimony. Furthermore, he had examined the medicine bottles found at the Crown Public House, and in one of them he had discovered a quantity of antimony. With the inquest and the court case progressing slowly, Jessie Toone, the nurse who had tended Maud Marsh over her final days, found herself the subject of public opprobrium. On Tuesday the 11th of November, she appeared at Southwark Police Court, charged with being drunk and disorderly. In her defence, she said that on the previous night she had been in a local pub when someone had called over the bar, "You are the woman who held the poor creature on the bed whilst old Chapman murdered and poisoned her." She was, she said, afraid to go outside her door. 2 men had come up to her the other night and told her that she should have her brains dashed out, and she should not know who was doing it if she had anything more to do with the case. Whilst accepting that there might be some truth in her claims, the magistrate opined that that did not justify her getting drunk, and he bound her over in the sum of £2 to be of good behaviour. It was now becoming apparent to the police that there was a good chance that Maud Marsh wasn't Chapman's only victim, and so applications were made to the Home Office to exhume the bodies of Mary Spink and Bessie Taylor. Permission having been granted, Inspector Godley and William Tull, the undertaker who had handled the funeral arrangements for Bessie Taylor, made the journey to Lymm. On the bitterly cold morning of Saturday the 22nd of November, a large number of police officers took up position to keep curious sightseers away from St Mary's churchyard, where a screen of white sheets had been erected around the Taylor family grave. At 5 a.m, a team of 3 gravediggers carrying lanterns approached the grave and began digging into the frozen earth. By 8 a.m, 3 coffins had been raised, and the one containing the remains of Bessie Taylor was then carried to a makeshift mortuary that had been erected in the churchyard. Here, William Tull scraped off the dirt and identified the nameplate as that of Bessie Chapman, and the lid was then unscrewed. Newspapers reported that the body was reasonably well preserved, and her brother and a close family friend had no difficulty in recognizing her. Dr. Thomas Stevenson and his 2 assistants then carried out a post-mortem, during which they removed her stomach and various organs, placed them in glass jars, sealed them, and then returned to London to analyse them. Testifying later at Chapman's trial, Stevenson confirmed that analysis had shown the presence of antimony in all those parts. At 2 p.m. on the afternoon of Monday the 8th December, a team of 6 gravediggers set to work in St Patrick's Cemetery, Leytonstone, to exhume the body of Mary Spink. Since she had been buried in a common grave and 5 years had elapsed since her interment, reaching her coffin proved an onerous task, and 8 coffins had to be removed before on the Tuesday morning the gravediggers reached that of Mrs. Spink and opened the coffin. Her body was so well preserved that 2 women who had known her well had no difficulty in identifying her. "There is no doubt," said one, "that is the face of the late Mrs. Chapman." Dr. Stevenson and his 2 assistants carried out a post-mortem, removed her stomach and other organs, placed them in sealed jars, and took them away for analysis. Once again, a large amount of antimony was present in the remains. The police now had concrete proof that Chapman was a repeat killer who had claimed the lives of at least 3 victims. On Thursday the 18th December, Coroner Waldo presided over the last day of the inquest into the death of Maud Marsh. After retiring for 20 minutes, the jury returned and announced that they had come to the conclusion that the death of Maud Eliza Marsh was caused by antimonial poisoning and that the poison was administered by George Chapman. A verdict of wilful murder was then returned against him, and he was committed to take his trial at the Old Bailey on the coroner's inquest. It was now time for him to face justice for the murders of his previous wives. At Chapman's court appearances in November and December, he had been charged as George Chapman. But on the 31st of December, Inspector Godley charged him under the name of Severin Klosowski with the wilful murder of Mary Isabella Spink, otherwise Chapman, on the 25th of December 1897, and with the wilful murder of Bessie Chapman, otherwise Taylor, on the 13th of February 1901. Godley later testified that, "When I told him of the name Klosowski and the charge was read over to him, he said, 'I do not know the other fellow.' In answer to the charge of murder, he said, 'By what means? Stabbing, shooting, or what?' I said, 'The inspector will read the charge to you after he has taken it down.' It was written down and read over to him. He said, 'Who is this other fellow?' I said, 'That is you. We call you Severin Klosowski, otherwise George Chapman.' He said, 'I do not know anything about the other man.'" As Godley was building his case against Klosowski, Detective Sergeant Neal was endeavouring to trace his first wife, Lucy Baderski. Looking back on his efforts in his autobiography, he recalled, "After interviewing about 60 people, I struck a clue that led me to Walthamstow, where I found Stanislaus Baderski, whose sister, Lucy, was Chapman's legal wife. That night I obtained her address from her brother. A day or so later, Godley arranged an identity parade at which, though she had not seen him for years, Lucy Klosowski went straight up to Chapman and identified him as her husband. "I don't know this woman," said Chapman. "Ah, Severino," she exclaimed, "don't say that. You remember the time you nearly killed me in Jersey City?" The Hastings chemist William Henry Davidson was also brought to London, and he identified Chapman as the man to whom he had supplied the tartar emetic found at the Crown. When he next appeared at Southwark Police Court on Wednesday the 7th of January 1903, he was charged as George Chapman with the murder of Maud Marsh, and as Severin Klosowski, otherwise called George Chapman, with the murders of Mary Isabella Spink and Bessie Taylor. By this time, the police had traced a string of reliable witnesses who could identify Chapman as Severin Klosowski, and they now began appearing as witnesses. Amongst those to testify that day was Wolfe Leveson, the traveller in hairdresser's materials, who had known Chapman as Ludwig Zagowski when he had worked at various establishments in Whitechapel. Asked by Chapman's solicitor what sort of a man this Zagowski had been, Leveson caused one of the few moments of levity when he became very animated and replied, "He was a la-di-da then, with black coat, patent boots, high hat and umbrella." Then, pointing at Chapman in the dock, he continued, "There he sits. He has not changed a bit. He has not a grey hair in his head." Over the next month, Chapman made several more appearances at Southwark Police Court, his final and 16th being on Wednesday the 11th of February, when he was formally charged and asked if he had anything to say. Replying on his behalf, his solicitor, Mr. Sidney, said that the accused pleaded not guilty. He reserved his defence, however, and called no witnesses at this stage. The magistrate, Mr. Chapman, then committed the accused to stand trial at the next Old Bailey sessions. According to the Halifax Evening Courier, as he left in charge of warders looking deadly pale, the audience at the back of the court set up a vigorous hissing. The trial of Severin Klosowski, alias George Chapman, opened at the Old Bailey on Monday the 16th of March 1903. His barrister, Mr. George Eliot, began by submitting that the prosecution should only be allowed to present the case against the accused for the murder of Maud Marsh, and not for the previous murders of any other women. In response, the Solicitor General, Sir Edward Carson, K.C., prosecuting, argued that he was entitled to open the facts and give evidence of the death of other women with whom the accused had lived. The judge, Mr. Justice Grantham, ruled that the evidence was clearly admissible. Chapman was then called upon to enter a plea, and he replied in a low voice, "Not guilty, sir." Over the next 4 days, witness after witness gave evidence as the case against Chapman was methodically laid out by the prosecution. On Thursday the 19th of March, Mr. Eliot rose for the defence. He evidently realised that, given the strength of the prosecution's case, his case was all but futile. He began by stating that he did not intend to present any evidence, but asked the jury to remember that he was not there to prove the accused's innocence, but rather to refute the proofs of guilt put forward by the Crown. He urged the jury to consider their verdict carefully, as, if there was any shred of doubt in their minds about his client's guilt, they might be condemning an innocent man to death. He laid considerable emphasis on the fact that Chapman was a foreigner, a hated alien, as he put it, and concluded by imploring the jury to exercise that wise and prudent consideration which always in this court holds the balance between right and wrong. The judge, in his summing up, reminded the jury that they were there to decide whether Maud Marsh died at the hands of the prisoner, and they had nothing to do with whether he also murdered Mrs. Spink and Miss Taylor, although they could, he said, consider their deaths in relation to helping them decide if what happened to Maud Marsh was accidental. He was particularly scathing of the doctors for not spotting what was happening to Maud Marsh, and pointed out that, had Dr. Grapple alerted Dr. Stoker the moment he suspected poisoning, then the girl's life might have been saved. He told them that they had to decide what caused the poor woman's death, whether it was given deliberately, and if so, who had had the opportunity of administering it. He dismissed the suggestion by the defence that the accused would be found guilty because of the alien question, observing that he had every confidence that the accused's nationality would play no part in their decision. Having praised the police for the dedication and diligence with which they had handled the case, he then asked the jury to retire and consider their verdict. According to newspaper accounts, as the judge concluded his summing up, Chapman broke down and wept. The jury retired at 5 p.m. and were out for 12 minutes. Returning, they gave a unanimous verdict of guilty. Mr. Justice Grantham then donned the black cap and, turning to a still weeping and deathly pale Chapman, he intoned, "Severin Klosowski, for I decline to call you by the English name you have assumed. The only satisfactory feature in the case we have just completed is that I am able to address you as a foreigner and not as an Englishman. The jury have come to the only conclusion which I am sure every one who has heard the case would have come to. I have but one duty to perform. It is the duty of sentencing you to death." Supported by 2 warders, Chapman was then taken to the cells, from where he was removed to Wandsworth Prison. There his name, age and nationality were noted in the jail's register. On being asked his nationality, Chapman insisted that he was an American subject, but it was placed in the register as Polish. The formalities over, Chapman was then put in the condemned cell, which, according to the People, was in fact a large, lofty and well-lighted room fitted up as a cell. On the morning of Friday the 20th of March, Chapman was visited in the condemned cell by the Under-Sheriff for the County of London, who told him that his execution had been set for 9 a.m. on Tuesday, April the 7th. On Monday, the 23rd of March, the Daily Chronicle reported that the police entertained the belief that he is connected with the Whitechapel murders of 1888. The paper stated that the police had discovered that at the time of the first 2 murders, Klosowski was undoubtedly occupying a lodging in George Yard, Whitechapel Road, where the first murder was committed. This is referring to his tenure at the White Hart, located at the entrance to George Yard, where the murder of Martha Tabram had occurred on the 7th of August 1888. It is also, it should be pointed out, wrong, as he didn't arrive at the White Hart until 1890. The paper also claimed that after Chapman left London, the murders ceased, but crimes of a similar nature occurred in America. Moreover, the article continued, Chapman always carried a black bag and wore a P&O cap. The man who was wanted in connection with the Whitechapel murders always wore a P&O cap and carried a black bag, according to the tale of some of the women who escaped him. In the light of these and other definite statements, the article continued, the police have considerable doubt whether the full extent of the criminality of Klosowski has been nearly revealed by the recent investigations, remarkable as they were in their extent. That day, the article was republished verbatim by newspapers across the country under headlines such as, "Is Chapman Jack the Ripper?" or "Is Klosowski Jack the Ripper?" The Pall Mall Gazette decided to seek the opinion of the man who is perhaps better qualified than anyone else in this country to express an opinion in this matter. Inspector Frederick George Abberline, formerly Chief Detective Inspector of Scotland Yard, the official who had full charge of the criminal investigation at the time of the terrible murders in Whitechapel. A representative of the newspaper duly called at Abberline's home. The retired detective told him that he was just about to write to the Assistant Police Commissioner to say how strongly I was impressed with the opinion that Chapman was also the author of the Whitechapel murders. There are a score of things which make one believe that Chapman is the man, Abberline continued, and you must understand that we have never believed all those stories about Jack the Ripper being dead, or that he was a lunatic, or anything of that kind. For instance, the date of the arrival in England coincides with the beginning of the series of murders in Whitechapel. There is a coincidence also in the fact that the murders ceased in London when Chapman went to America, while similar murders began to be perpetrated in America after he had landed there. The fact that he studied medicine and surgery in Russia before he came here is well established, and it is curious to note that the first series of murders was the work of an expert surgeon, while the recent poisoning cases were proved to be done by a man with more than an elementary knowledge of medicine. The story told by Chapman's wife of the attempt to murder her with a long knife while in America is not to be ignored. The article concluded with the observation that, altogether, Mr. Abberline considers that the matter is quite beyond abstract speculation and coincidence, and believes the present situation affords an opportunity of unravelling a web of crime such as no man living can appreciate in its extent and hideousness. Abberline's observations were challenged by George Sims in the Referee the following Sunday. I was rather surprised to find high-class newspapers suggesting Chapman as Jack the Ripper, he wrote. Jack was a homicidal maniac. Each crime that he committed was marked with greater ferocity during the progress of his insanity. How could a man in the mental condition of Jack have suddenly settled down into a cool, calculating poisoner? In response, Abberline gave another interview to the Pall Mall Gazette that was published on Tuesday the 31st of March. He refuted the suggestion that Jack the Ripper would not have settled down into a cool, calculating poisoner. As to the question of the dissimilarity of character in the crimes which one hears so much about, continued the expert, I cannot see why one man should not have done both, provided he had the professional knowledge, and this is admitted in Chapman's case. A man who could watch his wives being slowly tortured to death by poison, as he did, was capable of anything. Indeed, if the theory be accepted that a man who takes life on a wholesale scale never ceases his accursed habit until he is either arrested or dies, there is much to be said for Chapman's consistency. You see, incentive changes, but the fiendishness is not eradicated. The victims, too, you will notice, continue to be women, but they are of different classes, and obviously call for different methods of dispatch. George Sims, however, was not convinced. It is an absolute absurdity, he wrote in the next Sunday's Referee, to argue that a cool, calculating poisoner like Klosowski could have lived with half a dozen women and put them quietly out of the way by a slow and calculated process after being in 1888 a man so maniacal in his homicidal fury that he committed the foul and fiendish horror of Miller's Court. A furious madman does not suddenly become a slow poisoner. Writing in the trial of George Chapman many years later, Hargrave L. Adam claimed that Abberline had questioned Lucy Baderski about Chapman's nightly habits at the time of the murders. She said that he was often out until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, but she could throw little light on these absences. Abberline never wavered in his firm conviction that Chapman and Jack the Ripper were one and the same person. When Godley arrested Chapman, Abberline said to his confrère, You've got Jack the Ripper at last. It all sounds very convincing, except Abberline cannot have interviewed Lucy Baderski at the time of the murders in 1888, since Klosowski didn't meet and marry her until the following year. As for Abberline's having told Godley that he had caught Jack the Ripper at last upon his arresting George Chapman, Abberline actually told the Pall Mall Gazette reporter that he had only started thinking about Chapman being connected with the Whitechapel murders when he read the opening statements of his Old Bailey trial in March 1903, a good 4 months after Godley had arrested Chapman. According to Arthur Fowler Neal in 40 Years of Manhunting, we were never able to secure proof that Chapman was the Ripper, but the strong theory remains just the same. Jack the Ripper was a cold-blooded, inhuman monster who killed for the sake of killing. The same could be said of Severin Klosowski, alias George Chapman. Why he took to poisoning his women victims can only be ascribed to his diabolical cunning or some insane idea or urge to satisfy his inordinate vanity. In any case, it is the most fitting and sensible solution to the possible identity of the murderer in one of the world's greatest crime mysteries. Chapman, however, was saying nothing about the press rumours that he was Jack the Ripper. He was petitioning the Home Secretary for a reprieve. Having reviewed the case, the Home Secretary announced that no reprieve would be given and the execution would take place as planned on the 7th of April. Chapman spent his last days writing letters to various acquaintances in which he protested his innocence and maintaining till the bitter end that he was an American. He also drew up a new will in which he left what remained of his estate to the relatives of Bessie Taylor, the woman who, so he claimed in one letter, was a mother to me. So believe me, I am very grieved sorry for what happened, as I am perfectly innocent of all this treacherous accusation. Lucy Baderski made several attempts to visit him, but he refused to see her, insisting that he didn't know who she was. He was extremely restless throughout his last night and slept little. Shortly after 6 o'clock on the morning of Tuesday the 7th of April, he was awoken. Having dressed, he attended Mass, and at 7 o'clock he was given a breakfast of bread, butter, and coffee, but he hardly touched it. He was very moody and depressed, and as the hour of his execution drew closer, he displayed a nervous fear of his approaching fate, and the slightest sound caused him to start. At 3 minutes to 9, Billington, the hangman, entered the cell and pinioned Chapman's hands behind his back. The convict, so the newspapers reported, seemed half-dazed and made no resistance. He was offered some brandy and water, and then the procession, led by a priest carrying a crucifix, headed to the scaffold. Here he was assisted to the drop, the warders supporting him throughout. Billington then pinioned his legs, pulled the white cap over his head, and adjusted the noose. The warders and Billington then stepped quickly aside, the bolt was pulled, and Chapman disappeared from view. Death was instantaneous. A large crowd had gathered outside the prison to await the execution, and rumours were circulating that Chapman had confessed to being Jack the Ripper and had told the authorities that he was wanted for lots of murders in Russia. But none of these proved to be true. Whatever secrets Severin Klosowski had went with him to the grave. In June 1903, Chapman's possessions were auctioned in Horseshoe Yard, Newington Causeway, near the Crown. The Beverley Independent reported on the auction in its edition of Saturday, June the 20th. All the goods, household effects, wearing apparel, etc. of the murderer were submitted to public auction, and, as the result of some rather sensational advertising, a large crowd of persons attended.
It was reported that an offer of £120 for the whole lot had been made by telegram, but as the auctioneer regarded this offer with some doubt, the lots were sold separately, and as a matter of fact they only fetched a little over £42. A faded bunch of flowers given to Maud Marsh 2 days before her death realised 15 shillings, and Chapman's P&O cap, which he was wearing when arrested, was sold for 5 shillings. The bicycles on which Chapman and Maud Marsh used to ride realised £6. His pianoforte, brought by Chapman from his hairdresser's establishment in Hastings and so often played upon there by his victims, fetched £5, and 4 shillings and sixpence was paid for the glass found in Maud Marsh's room, which was supposed to have contained the fatal dose of poison. 4 volumes of the Family Physician, produced at the murder trial and alleged to have been the books from which he gained his knowledge of poison, fetched £2 2 shillings. Quart pots from his old public house sold for 3 shillings apiece, and his autograph for 4 shillings. And so the story of Severin Klosowski, alias George Chapman, draws to a close. Whether or not he was actually Jack the Ripper is now impossible to ascertain. All that can be truly said is that he is as likely as any other suspect to have been the perpetrator of the crimes, and the case for his candidature is probably a lot stronger than that for many of the other suspects whose names have been put forward for the mantle of history's most infamous serial killer. As for his motive for the 3 murders he was proved to have committed, one was never established. It would appear that he was just a ruthless killer with no empathy for the terrible suffering to which he subjected his unfortunate victims, Mary Isabella Spink, Elizabeth Bessie Taylor, and Maud Marsh, the 3 women whose lives he cut so tragically and so horribly short.